Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the CQC webinar this afternoon with the Well-Led Provider. This is the fifth webinar that we've done this year in our CQC series, and today's topic is about workforce well-being and the implication of it shifting when the new single assessment framework came in from the well-led key question to the caring key question. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that might have happened, what it signifies in terms of the importance of workforce well-being, and then what implications that might have on you when it comes to your CQC compliance, particularly in the caring key question. Most of you have been on these webinars before, but just a little bit of housekeeping that you're welcome to use the chat and the QA functions as we go along, and we'll try our best to answer questions as we go along, or we'll put them to Gabby at the end, or failing that, we do sometimes email people afterwards with responses if we can't respond in the moment, so do use that. There's no need necessarily to take notes and screenshots, because everybody who's registered for the webinar, whether you've managed to attend or not, everybody who's registered will get sent an email afterwards with the details of how to access the recording and then the slides from that recording. And that will be sent to everybody by email, probably tomorrow or Friday, and the email will come from the Well-Led Provider. So hopefully that allows you to sit back and sort of enjoy the presentation as much as you can, albeit it's about the CQC. And we've got some new faces today, I think, in the audience. So Gabby, it's not just GP practices, we've got some people from social care sector and possibly also from some foundation trusts as well. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Claire Sieber. I'm a GP and I'm Chief Medical Officer at the Well-Led Provider, which is part of Redmore Health. Gabby is on the call, who you will meet shortly, who is our former CQC inspector who leads on these webinars and also delivers our mock CQC inspection service, amongst other things. And the other person that you'll meet a bit later is Gary, who is a former practice manager, an associate of the Well-Led Provider, and also delivers a lot of our services that we provide to people, which I'll give you a run through of at the end. And our webinars are very kindly sponsored by the Medicines Management team, who you will meet at the end, and they will spend 5 minutes talking about what they offer to practices and PCNs. So a warm welcome to them as well. Next slide, please, Gabby. I'll let you take over.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see, some familiar faces and some new faces as well, especially from adult social care. So for those of you who have joined us before or who are new, we just do a very, very quick run through of data that we've collected at the end of each month to give you just sort of a bit of an insight into the levels of reports that are being published across the two directorates, so across GP practices. And we have specifically put care home information in here, but we might have some home care as well. Again, you can see the sort of the significant difference between GP practices and adult social care services being reported upon. But in terms of percentages, it's kind of still around the 60 to 70% for goods. Unfortunately, no outstandings have been published for June this month, but we've got over a handful, which is quite positive for adult social care, and sort of the 20 to 30% relative to each for the requires improvement or inadequate. So part of today's webinar, we will actually be going through some extracts of outstanding, inadequate and good and requires improvement reports that were published the month before, sort of the last couple of months. So when we do reference outstanding, just know that there are some recent examples that we'll have a look at today. And we do always encourage, as part of the sort of ongoing compliance and mock inspection work that we do for registered managers or practice managers or providers, to select a couple of reports that have been published each month and use those in areas such as your team meetings, your one-to-ones, your protected learning time in your practice, and just draw from current best practice examples that are being shared by the CQC. So before we go into the particular topic of caring, we tend to just run through some questions that we receive in advance. Some of them are relevant to the caring topic and some of them are sort of slightly off key, but still potentially useful for people. So this month we've had one question about the introduction of the new contract. So this is for GP practices to have online consultations open until 6:30 from October, and new software including AI. So what will inspectors be looking for to ensure we're safe and well led in this area? It's quite a big question. We'll probably do a whole webinar specifically on this, but we as a team have made some bullet points for you to think about. And as Claire said, you will get this information at the end, so I won't run through all of them. But from a sort of logistics point of view, obviously make sure that you're doing your data protection impact assessments, making sure that you are managing data correctly. So with your specific DPO lead, looking at specific necessary purposes, and that you are confident with your compliance from a GDPR perspective, and also that any notifications from a data breach perspective are correctly managed. And one question that inspectors might ask your staff is, who's your DPO lead, or who would you go to if there was a potential breach or an incident with regards to the software and AI. So just making sure that your workforce are aware of the policies, the procedures and the systems that you've got in place. And I think, yeah, as we all know, sort of making sure that you have a very clear implementation process. So the earlier that you can start managing that, the better, and onboarding your staff in a sort of caring, considerate, inclusive way as much as possible. So in particular, if you do have staff that have any reasonable adjustments or who might want to volunteer to be digital champions in any capacity, then making sure that you're using the interest and the skills of your workforce, but also considering those that do have protected characteristics or might need reasonable adjustments put in place. So the CQC would be looking for that to be well considered as well. Other questions we've had. So what's one thing would you suggest we all do now? And I think probably that's in relation to this, the single assessment, or now just titled the assessment framework that exists, and the way that the CQC are working in a sort of more ongoing way rather than an inspection and a fixed point of time. So again, we always advocate for sort of sense checking your quality and compliance data. So whether that be internal resources that you've got in existing quality framework, your governance policies and procedures that you should all have in place with an audit framework, making sure that you align those with the way that the CQC works. So thinking about the 4 ratings, the 4 scorings, gathering data, and just make sure that you yourself are sense checking your own quality and compliance on a regular basis. And obviously also accessing external sort of support if you need, for example, through the well-led provider, things such as mock inspections. I think given the length of time now between CQC visits, we know that we're looking at some practices that are 10 years plus between having had a CQC inspection. We are sort of the work that we do, particularly with the mock inspections, and I'm sure Gary and Claire would have some thoughts on this as well, is that I'm often seeing more of a tunnel vision, or individuals holding roles quite closely to their chest and putting CQC compliance off. Sort of that sense that nobody's been in touch, therefore we don't need to look outward towards CQC compliance, and we'll deal with it when it arrives. But all of that, we often find when we then do mock inspections or we do compliance or governance audits, is that there tends to be more de-skilling across the team. So because people aren't having those conversations about CQC compliance regularly, because roles aren't being shared, managers might not be leaning on their peers or other colleagues across the workforce as much. It does mean that I tend to be seeing a little bit more de-skilling than I used to, potentially a lack of cohesive or joint working, and a reduction in creativity and an inability to demonstrate CQC compliance. So I think it's worth, although nobody likes to talk about CQC, there are many benefits to having it as part of a regular conversation, so that it doesn't feel sort of like foreign or news that you don't want to deal with just yet. Another question we received, I'm constantly being asked what training CQC expect to see in general practice. And I know for those of you who are in adult social care on the call, it's slightly different. You do have the care certificate, and NICE and Sky Guidance do tend to provide a lot more information about adult social care. In GP practices, there's no list as such, but can you enlighten us as to what we ought to include as a minimum? So the main thing to say here, and it's actually the bottom bullet point, apologies, but the legislation, to be really clear, from the CQC does simply say that you must have sufficient numbers of suitably qualified, competent, skilled and experienced staff to meet the needs of people using the service at all times. So the person who submitted this question is right in the sense that there is no mandated list that has been put out there from the CQC, but they do lean on other resources such as the British Medical, the BMA, the GMC, NICE obviously have some information out there. So there is a lot of information to tell you what would be expected from a sort of a standard safety perspective. So we've included here safeguarding, IPC, BLS, hopefully if anyone doesn't know the acronyms, drop a message, apologies, the Mental Capacity Act, fire safety, health and safety and manual handling. So they're the minimum sort of core training requirements that the BMA recommend. They do also then include guidance on anaphylaxis, complaints and conflict resolution, duty of candour, GDPR and information governance. We know that there's an update about learning disability and autism training that is a requirement under the Health and Social Care Act of 2022. So that does need to be included. Chaperone training is very important, and whistleblowing and freedom to speak up. So they sort of all fall under the safeguarding umbrella potentially. GDPR I've included twice, so I was obviously very keen on that one. And equality and diversity and sepsis awareness. So those are other best practice examples that are out there and suggested, and things that I would probably be looking for on a mock inspection or when I was doing inspections for the CQC. So the thing to talk about is duplicate training. I think that's something that we're all quite keen to reduce. Obviously, the burden on GPs for training is quite cumbersome. And so if, for example, if you have got locums, if you are working in private practice and you're using consultants who work across different services, there is some really clear guidance out there about the fact that you should look for systems and processes to show that you're not putting GPs under pressure to duplicate training. And there are systems that you can implement within your policies and your procedures to demonstrate that they are already compliant without having to repeat the mandatory training. So again, it's just to reiterate that the exact training requirements are dependent on the role and specific responsibilities of each practice and the needs of people using the service. And it is ultimately down to you to determine what's needed. So I know that's probably not the answer that everybody wants, but hopefully the first two bullet points give you the kind of fundamentals that we would be looking for. Another question that we received more recently, was specifically about the key question, caring and looking at workforce wellbeing, is how do we improve the well-led area of staff culture when the result is based on negative staff comments not wanting to do the job they're employed to do? Or how do we help staff understand the difference between what is well-led and being able to meet unreasonable expectations from staff? So I put these two questions together because there's clearly a theme here about sort of potentially staff not doing what's in their job description or what their roles and responsibilities are, and the expectations that staff have versus the reality of the job. And I know that Gary is probably, well, he's definitely much more of an expert in this area than I am. So he might have some thoughts at the end of this. But one thing that I often introduce whenever we do the well-led review, so specifically looking at the well-led question, is introducing a competency framework. So if that's not something you already have, it might be something that you would want support to develop. And the 7 core competencies, of which I've only included 6, so I'll update that slide later. The 7 core competencies, what I tend to then do is look at the effective and ineffective behaviours. So that can be a framework that you introduce from a HR perspective, so that if you are having difficulties with staff meeting job description, meeting roles and responsibilities, and how that impacts on the culture, then this can be quite a productive and more, I suppose, positive way of challenging staff members or working with staff members. So there's just an example here of a list of things that you can work with staff to demonstrate what's an effective versus an ineffective behaviour. Again, the CQC, they wouldn't be looking at the details of how you're doing this. Obviously, they are just looking at the overall culture, and so the tools that you use are up to you, but they're, you know, they want to see the outcomes really. So yeah, this is just an idea to have a competency framework, and if that's something that you are struggling with or interested in, then obviously get in touch with us after this webinar, and we can share some more sort of top tips and tools to help you in that area. So we're now just going to talk about the caring key question and staff wellbeing. But we did think this would be a really interesting topic because for those of you who remember the Chloes now, they weren't that long ago, but it feels like a lifetime ago. We did see that staff wellbeing actually fell specifically under the key question of well-led. So some of the Chloes that I've extracted for you, just to show you as an example, were that the CQC were looking and interested in high levels of satisfaction across all staff, wanting to see that staff were proud to work at the organisation, and they spoke highly of the culture. We've got staff at all levels actively encouraged to speak up and raise concerns. There were processes to support and promote the positive well-being of your staff. Leadership actively promoting staff empowerment to drive improvement, and raising concerns was encouraged and valued. Talking about equality and diversity and recognising and acting upon any workforce inequality, and involving all staff to ensure that their voices are heard. So if you've joined our webinar series over the last 12 months, you will reckon, and if you sort of know the key questions, sorry, the quality statements and the key question now, you will see that a lot of those do fall still under well-led. So when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about culture, when we talk about freedom to speak up, when we talk about learning lessons, those the wording of those have all been changed somewhat to make it really clear under well-led that you do want to be including your workforce, and when the CQC is speaking to your workforce, that the workforce essentially respond to the CQC to say that they are, you know, they are actively involved. They feel confident that if they do raise any concerns or if they have any ideas, that they are all well considered, acted upon, and then change can be seen. But interestingly, what happened with the CQC, with this assessment framework, is that they then moved some of those Chloes, I guess is the best way to explain it, from the well-led key question into the caring key question, and they introduced a new quality statement called workforce wellbeing and enablement. So here we've got some specific bullet points under that quality statement that talks about that we care about and promote the well-being of our staff, and we always support them and enable them to deliver person-centered care. So that's really important. I think hopefully we'll talk about that in a little bit more in a moment. The provider recognises and meets the well-being needs of staff. So these include necessary resources and facilities for safe working, such as regular breaks and rest areas. People benefit from staff who have regular opportunities to provide feedback, raise concerns, and suggest ways to improve the service. They're looking for a culture that normalises good well-being. Staff are supported if they're struggling at work, and there's a sense of belonging and the ability to contribute to decision making. So you'll see when we look back at the Chloes and when we see these now, there are some crossovers and there are some similarities, but they have moved from one key question to another. So I know many of you will be thinking, why does it matter? Essentially, we need to care about our staff, and we absolutely do. So we will talk about that. The reason it matters, though, from a CQC ratings perspective under the new assessment framework, I'm just sort of trying to break it down for you on the screen here, is that it could, if you don't get staff wellbeing right, it could have an impact on your overall rating. So hopefully those of you're familiar with the way that the scoring works now under the new assessment framework. But if we explain it in the way that there are 5 quality statements under caring, the maximum score that you could get therefore is 20, because the most points you can get is outstanding, which is 4. So 4 times 5 is 20. Let's just say, however, that in most of the areas, so 4 out of the 5 quality statements, you score good. So you're getting 3, which is good, times 4 quality statements is 12. But then under the workforce wellbeing quality statement, you only get 1. So you've been scored inadequate in that particular area. The CQC aren't confident that you are considering your workforce wellbeing appropriately. Then you will get a score of 13 out of 20, which is 65%. So that is still at the lower end of good from a threshold point of view, but it does actually mean that you have an automatic rating of requires improvement. And then that also means that any requires improvement or inadequate ratings that you get mean that you can't achieve outstanding. And I know that many of you on the call are very, very keen to look at ways in which we can achieve outstanding and what that looks like in practice. So you absolutely can't hide behind the new scoring system and the new framework. So the CQC have, they've specified if the key question score is within the good range, but one or more of the quality statements is 1, then you are limited to requires improvement. And if the key question score is within the outstanding range, but one of or more of the quality statements is inadequate or requires improvement, then you are limited to good. So if you're aiming for outstanding, but you don't take this seriously, you may only get good. If you're looking at good and you are good, but you don't take this sort of matter seriously, then you would be limited to requires improvement. So just to explain from a logistics point of view, it does have an impact. So what we're going to do now is have a look at some reports that we've pulled from the last few months, as I mentioned, across GP and adult social care services. And they have had this particular quality statement inspected and received, well, we'll start with outstanding. So these particular services have received an outstanding rating. So examples include staff met together each day for a coffee break, for which the provider arranged for coffee and snacks to be prepared. Positive comments were made regarding this and the improved team relationships which had been built. So you're probably sick of me talking about the 3 Ps, triangulating the evidence for the CQC. So we talk about policies and procedures, we talk about the outcomes for patients or people receiving care, and we talk about your personnel, so your workforce. And you can see really clearly here that the provider has put a process in place, the personnel, so your workforce, have responded positively about it. And as an outcome, there has been an improvement in the team relationships, which we know then does equal or result in more person-centred care and better care being delivered for people. Another example was social events to promote team building and bonding had been implemented and staff reported they'd been positive. So one person commented that staff teams across the 2 surgeries had got to know each other better, despite not all non-clinical staff working across both sites. The staff reported that this would help more cohesive working across processes. Another extract, the provider had a focused approach to staff wellbeing. So they'd recognised that between April 23 and March 24, there'd been an increased turnover in staff. So a staff wellbeing lead had been appointed with the aim to improve staff experiences. And as a result, since April 2024, only 1 staff member had left. So you can see a significant difference there in terms of the data. So they're collecting the data, they've done something about it, and then they've seen a positive outcome. As a small service, they knew each other very well and were able to work to each person's strengths while being aware of any wellbeing issues which have come up both professionally and personally. So again, that's reflective of the person-centred care area that the CQC are looking at. And interestingly, I've never seen this before, but a wellbeing policy was in place, which encouraged a positive culture to support individuals to take steps to improve their health and wellbeing when at work. So yeah, it would be interesting to hear if anybody does have a wellbeing policy, if they want to put that in the chat, not the policy, but to let us know that you have that. It would be interesting to see sort of how common that is out there, potentially something we all could take away with us from this call. So requires improvement extracts. So we've got here, and again, these have all been incorporated with the idea about the 3 Ps aligning. So examples, staff felt able to raise concerns, for example, concerns with the building or furniture that needed replacing. However, they told us that action was not always taken or was put on hold in view of future renovations that were planned. So essentially, staff have suggestions for improvement, but there's no action taken, and they don't feel that there's any value in them providing feedback. We can see that staff told us they'd received an induction, but it was not evident from the staff files. So we know from having listened to me for the last 12 months and hopefully from having been involved with the CQC for longer, that if it's not recorded and you don't have evidence, then it's very difficult for the CQC to give you a good rating in that area. So another extract, while staff told us during the assessment they enjoyed working at the practice, the provider couldn't demonstrate how they formally sought staff views in order to make further improvements and monitor impact on staff satisfaction. So again, if there's no evidence of staff surveys being done, or other processes in place to get staff views, then it's not happening. And without that evidence, it's difficult to demonstrate that you are good in this particular area. Staff immunisation information had not been collected for all staff where relevant, and there were no risk assessments to demonstrate that the risk had been assessed and relevant action taken to protect staff and patients. And another example, the provider sent us evidence of 4 workstation assessments for non-clinical staff. 2 had been completed after our visit, and the 2 staff had identified issues with the workstations. Both had reported suffering health issues, but there was no evidence of action being taken to support staff. So again, from a wellbeing perspective, it's clear that the provider might be doing the initial part of the work, so sending out the workstation assessments to be completed, but the next steps aren't being followed up on, and therefore staff won't feel that their wellbeing is being respected or sort of well managed. And finally, we've got some extracts from reports that were published that received an inadequate rating in this particular key question and quality statement. So staff told us they didn't always feel valued by leaders. Leaders had not taken steps to recognise and meet the wellbeing needs of staff. So there weren't necessary resources and facilities for safe working, such as breaks or rest areas. Staff reported they were struggling at work. There was no evidence of annual appraisals or protected learning time. Ongoing professional development needs hadn't been identified, and staff told us they undertook instead their own self-directed learning. And the IMS information, I've included that across both as well for you. So just some notes, just some, I guess, tools for you to sort of think about and consider in terms of why this key question, why it matters to get it right. We know that if you take a caring approach and if you support your staff and their well-being, that it does ultimately enhance employee morale, motivation and productivity, whilst also reducing stress and absences from work. And it can lead to a more positive work environment, improved staff retention, and a stronger reputation for the practice. So again, it's a question that we come across very regularly about managing retention, supporting retention, experiencing high turnarounds and the impact that might have, not just from a CQC perspective, but from an effective, running of a practice or in social care, but, the effective running of a service. So the evidence is very, very clear, and it's out there that the more that we invest in staff wellbeing, the less likely they are to leave, and therefore you do have sort of higher retention, higher productivity, and a reduction in stress or other work-related illnesses. And we've got here a sort of a tool that you can use to make staff wellbeing part of your strategic plan. So we saw earlier some notes about what from the outstanding service that had a wellbeing policy in place. Staff wellbeing, we definitely should be seeing this integrated more into the governance paperwork, the policies, the processes that you have. So whether that's part of your continuity plan, whether that's part of your strategic plan, your business development plan, anything that you have sort of out there, it's important that staff wellbeing is integrated into that. And it's certainly something that the CQC would be looking at now under the new inspection framework. So we look here about the business planning, we're talking about recruitment. So at your recruitment stage, how are you introducing the topic of staff wellbeing, talking to potential employees about what you offer, what's in place, making sure that your induction, bless you, Claire, making sure that your induction is really clear about staff wellbeing. So when staff are onboarded, is there a particular time dedicated to workforce wellbeing? For example, are they being given a mentor, a buddy? Is there a particular sort of other resources that you want to get them signed up to? I know, for example, there's always the EAP. Sometimes we're seeing apps out there that support mental health, that give you top tips for looking at your well-being. But I think actually sitting down with staff, making sure that they're logged in, helping them navigate through that, the different apps and the different systems that you have. It's about going that one step further so that it's not just seen as a token gesture or something that's there if they need it, because that's arguably quite a reactive response, but actually being proactive in your introduction to wellbeing services that you provide. We know the importance of regular check-ins and your annual appraisal. Again, one thing that we're looking for is making sure that they're meaningful and that workforce and their well-being, their health and well-being form part of those discussions. So, you know, it's not just the check-ins and the appraisals aren't purely process. You know, it's not just looking at compliance data. It's not just looking at have you achieved A, B, and C, but it's actually how are you amongst all of that. And it sounds silly, but we're still seeing so many different versions of one-to-ones and appraisals that just don't check in with staff initially about how they are. Training, you know, if we're thinking potentially about away days, if we're thinking about additional training on top of the mandatory training, we are seeing an increase, for example, in mental health first aid staff that are being trained. But interestingly, one question that I always ask is, what does that mean for you to be a mental health first aider? Or if you're speaking to the staff, do you know that you have a mental health first aider, or what does that mean in practice? And the answers are quite limited. So although it seems to be an increase in uptake, it's not always clear what that actually means on the ground. So thinking about additional training resources that are out there. Surveys, I think I've just seen a question come in about surveys, but making sure that the questions that you ask, again, are focused on their well-being. So, you know, do you feel able to give suggestions, raise concerns? Do you feel that we listen to you when you do? Have you seen improvements as a result of suggestions that you've given? Do you get sufficient breaks? Is the staff room that you relax and rest in relaxing or restful? Or actually, for example, is it that other colleagues are coming in and talking about work, so it's not necessarily a safe space or a work-free space? If people prefer quiet areas or loud areas, you know, have they been able to have a say in what those areas look like? Again, we've talked about policies and procedures, so thinking about introducing a wellbeing policy or embedding it into the documents that you have from a governance point of view. And exit interviews, very, very important. We all know how important they are, and yet how poorly they often are done, unfortunately. So again, I know that Gary and Claire would have a lot more sort of probably insight into the importance of those and some top tips and suggestions for you. So if you were looking to amend your exit interview templates, it's worth getting those right, because you can learn a huge amount from that. And actually the CQC would also be taking that information into consideration. If you've had a huge staff turnover, it's one thing to recognise that and to say we've had a lot of staff leave, but if you don't know why, and you're not then doing something with that information in order to drive change or implement changes, then essentially it's for no reason really. You've experienced a high amount of stress, a high amount of turnover, but with no positive outcomes or no lessons learned from it. So those things are all worth thinking about. And I know that when I was an inspector with the CQC, one term that they always used to use was the golden thread, and that was specifically for equality and diversity and human rights. And they would sort of the approach that we took was that equality and diversity wasn't something that you inspected specifically. So you didn't sit down and have one conversation. There wasn't one piece of data about that particular topic, but it was a thread that we expected to be woven throughout all of the work that we would see with staff, with people, with the community, with other stakeholders. And I think the same definitely applies for staff wellbeing. We can see that in, for example, the key question SAFE under learning culture and incident management, that we expect, or the CQC are looking for how staff are involved in that process. We can see here from the information we've gone through today that there's a huge emphasis on wellbeing under the key question of caring. Well-led, it absolutely falls into, from culture, from inclusion, from freedom to speak up. There are elements of staff wellbeing in responsive as well. We're looking at person-centered care, and effective when we're thinking about, you know, how our workforce are trained and able to deliver evidence-based treatment. So it really does fall throughout all of the 5 key questions of the CQC inspection and the CQC framework. But I think, yeah, it's just interesting to think about how it does fall under caring, and caring for your staff really does matter for many reasons. So we're going to now move to Gary and Claire. We've got some, for those of you who've joined the webinars before, we do the hot seat, so we ask some questions to them both. And then I think after that, Claire, we can run through if there's been any questions in the chat, and then we'll hand over for some more information. So first question is for Gary. It's a long one. So you will see from the report extracts above that something as simple as a coffee and snack break are being reported as having positive impact for the workforce of a GP practice. And in the 2023 Just and Learning Charter, it does discuss wellbeing and says, we will ensure the basic needs of staff are met and the importance of these are not underestimated, including access to hot meals, drinking water and dedicated space for breaks. So my question is, surely, this is me being a cynic, really, surely there's more to wellbeing than these basic needs? Or do you think that these fundamentals can have a big impact? And if so, what barriers are in place for introducing what is arguably such a simple concept? And how would you try to overcome these?
Thanks, Gabby. That's a big question. I think they're really, really important. And if you take them away, then you're going to notice them even more. But I think the important thing is, don't make staff wellbeing just about giving them tea and coffee and a break for it. It's so much more than that. And, if you're giving them tea, coffee, where at the practice I'm sitting in at the moment, have a huge array of bottles of squash as well. The expense of these things is tiny compared to the benefits you're going to get. But for me, wellbeing, more importantly, it's about, the leaders in the practices, whether that's the managers, the partners, whatever. Get close to your staff, ask how they are, what they're feeling. We've had questions in the chat about, surveys and things. Yeah, great. Do surveys once, twice a year, but don't wait for those. Be there with your staff, be present and engaged, and find out what they're thinking, how they're feeling. If they need something, then, do it for them. And just going back to the practice that I'm in today, it's a very large practice, but they go to really great lengths to build a community in their practice. And they're consistently and constantly doing a variety of small things. And they are small things. They never miss an occasion to celebrate, mark some success or achievement. They've got lots of different social groups going on. They're always giving tiny little tokens and gifts for everybody. And I mean tiny little things. But because they consistently do it, the impact it has is significant, and the cost is, in comparison, is actually negligible. So I think, think about your staff and don't make it just about breaks, but, there's masses you can do. Long answer for a long question.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Gary. And actually, it makes me think, I'm going to sort of sneak in with a second question there, because it's made me think about, we spoke earlier throughout the examples of the report extracts, and you've just touched on it as well, about having a staff room, a rest area. And I always find it, I don't know the answer to this, but it'd be useful to get your thoughts about how much should managers spend time with their staff? So if you think, for example, in a staff room, it's where people go to rest, it's people go to offload. Do you want your practice manager or your registered manager in there with you, or do you want it to be a place that you can talk freely and confidently? Because I suppose, in one sense, if it's a free space that your manager's not in, you might be more open. But actually, then there's no way of your manager knowing how you feel, and there's a lot to be said for just putting the kettle on, having a couple of bickies and having those very informal offloads. What are your thoughts on how present should a manager be?
Very, very present every day. Yeah. As busy as practice managers are, the most valuable time of your day will be when you get up out of your chair and go and speak to your staff and how well they are. And a practice manager that Kay Keane, that possibly a lot of us will know, I know she gets up every day to go around her staff and just see how they are. And that's the sort of thing you should be doing. Because even if you're only spending 15 minutes to go around the surgery, or, that's going to be invaluable time, and that's going to build the relationships and the bridges, and that's, going to be, it'll pay dividends.
Yeah. Amazing, thank you. Okay, next question for Claire here. There we go. So every practice should be aware of the Equality Act of 2010, and hopefully has policies and procedures in place. And the CQC will be looking for evidence of reasonable adjustments. Are there any initiatives that you've seen to support mental health on your locum travels?
Yeah, I suppose there's the obvious ones that we can think of, like giving people who need it sort of extra time slots for catching up and for doing their admin. I've seen lots of practices that'll do regular walks and yoga and sports events. There's smattering of food all over the place, regular pizzas, loads of Easter eggs at Easter, bacon baps on a certain day of the week in the morning, standing desks. They're good for the mental health too. Although sometimes I see practices where the GPs have a standing desk and then nobody else seems to have a standing desk. And I do think to myself, I'm sure other members of staff would appreciate a standing desk too. I thought I'd just share a funny story because it came to me when Gary was mentioning something. Those of you that know me a little bit might know that at the moment my clinical work is locuming, so I go into lots of practices and see how things are set up. And I went to one practice a couple of years ago, and I was being shown around the coffee room, and somebody explained to me, this is the kettle, this is the little strainer. Make sure if you make yourself a cup of tea, put the strainer over your mug as you're pouring the boiling water in, because the kettle is full of fluff. We've asked the GP partner if we could please have a new kettle, and they've said no. And then sort of 5 seconds later, you could hear the rumbling of a V8 engine pulling into the surgery car park, which was the car of this partner. And it just made me think, God, that kettle is peanuts compared to what message you're sending across by saying to staff that they must continue to use the fluffy kettle and use the strainer when they're straining out their boiling water for their cup of tea, and what impression it then puts on temporary staff when they're coming in as well. But the places where I see the staff that are the happiest at work are the places where it's a great place to work, where there's good work-life balance, people feel valued, respected, encouraged to speak, actively asked how they are regularly, like, for example, with that kind of walk around that Gary was talking about, where their personal and professional development is supported in their working hours, when they have mentoring, when they're rewarded regularly with small gestures and just verbal praises amongst everybody, not just with little gimmicks once a year. That's really where I see it having the most impact. And I know that's not the answer maybe people were looking for. So there isn't just a thing that you can do quickly that will help this. It's kind of a long-term effort that's required, doing the hard stuff that makes your practice a good place to work.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I can't believe that story about the kettle, but I'll be in shock about that for days, but there we go. But no, I think, as you and Gary have both alluded to, it's about being consistent. It's not one token gesture that you can do. It's not Easter eggs in April and then, the rest of the year you stop caring. It's about being sort of the everyday walk-arounds, the everyday communication. The Easter eggs don't hurt, of course, but it is about having a really consistent approach to the way in which you demonstrate well-being. So that's useful. Thank you. Next question for Gary. So navigating a staff member's well-being as part of their return to work can be difficult if their requirements don't align with service delivery. Are there any top tips you have for practice managers who are facing this dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, it can be challenging, but the top tip I have is talk to your staff, and that should be the person that's coming back and the rest of the team. Don't make assumptions, because if you do, and if you keep others in the dark, then they'll guess and make assumptions, and that rarely goes well. And I say that with, you've got to be making sure that you're talking about things that it's appropriate, and you've got sort of permission to talk about, but talk to the person coming back and other staff as well. I think making this easier is through things like making sure that staff are multi-skilled, so it's easier to cover and things like that, and creating a real team spirit as well. That is going to help. But I'd also say, you should see supporting your staff as a long-term investment, because if you and the team have to give something in the short term, then it's going to be appreciated. They'll be more committed. And then in the long term, you're going to find they repay that back to you. So you should see supporting your staff for things like this as a long-term investment.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, and I suppose maybe could you just talk a little bit about the idea of keeping in touch with people when they are away? So if it's work related, if it's illness, maternity, anything like that, what's the value? How much is too much, or what's enough? And
Yeah, I mean, you know, those keep in touch days, and it's classically maternity leave as well. I think it's really important. You know, it's something that you maybe want to think about. If we take the example of maternity leave, you know, you don't want to be pestering people and making them feel uncomfortable, but you do want to keep in touch to know that you're interested in them and how they're doing. And if it's a longer period, you know, it may be that at the start those conversations can be how are you doing, and they can evolve as you get to the end to shall we have a conversation about, you know, what sort of returning might look like for you and how that will work for you. But, you know, again, it's building the relationship. So do it, you know, whether it's to just show interest in how they're doing and how they're coping, and then, you know, make that sort of transition and change into, okay, let's think about coming back to work and how that looks like. So I think they're vitally important, keeping in touch.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like that. I love that way of looking at it, that actually it's in the beginning it is just about caring. How are you? You know, maternity, any absence for whatever reason, just to show that you are genuinely interested in them is half the battle, isn't it? And work can come later, which I really
because
like.
maybe one way to think about it is, how would it feel like to be forgotten? You know, that would feel horrible. If you were that person, how would it feel like to be forgotten, whether that's illness, maternity, or whatever? So don't let that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, so final question for Claire. When thinking about recruitment at senior level, what skills and qualifications or experience would you be looking out for as part of the application and interview process that would indicate that that person could effectively contribute towards a wellbeing agenda and have a positive impact on staff wellbeing?
Yeah. Yes. So I think that this again comes back to my earlier point and also Gary's earlier point. Is there somebody who sees well-being as something that sits alone, that they can do a thing for, like say, I did a team day? Or do they see it as something that's woven through absolutely everything that they do in the workplace as a manager and dependent on everything else that's going on in the workplace? And do they place as much emphasis on making it a great place to work as they do the patient outcomes and the profits and all of the other things that a senior manager will have their eye on? If they're giving it that sort of weighting, then I think that is what is important to look for in a senior manager, rather than any sort of specific thing, perhaps gimmicky, that they might have introduced. And just picking up on Gary's point as well about it taking time. We're all so short of time at the moment in our settings that we work in, but it really is an investment if you can invest in your staff and their well-being, because our staffing costs in all of the sectors that we're working in on this call are our biggest cost. And if we could do anything to reduce staff turnover and sickness, it will actually affect the kind of profits at the bottom line more than some of the other stuff that we might spend our time doing on, say, claiming for certain things. So it is worth spending the time on as well.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. Okay, so I think that is it from me. I'm just going to hand over to Claire to talk a little bit about the workforce wellbeing workshops that are available, and I'll have a quick peek at some of the questions as well.
Thanks, Gabby. I think we've been trying to answer them as we go, although there was one about a staff survey, which I might come on to in a moment. So we have launched just last month some workforce wellbeing workshops for practices or groups of practices or PCNs or federations to buy for us to deliver for clinical and non-clinical team members, from the most senior to the most junior. And we have a selection of 3 workshops to choose from that you can do as standalone ones, or you can do them as a series of 3. And we're also receiving expressions of interest from people who would like to be part of some group coaching if they're thinking they'd like to be a workforce wellbeing champion within their workplace. So you can find out more details about those on our website, and I'll send some information around in the follow-up email that I'll send at the end. We did also do a free taster webinar of the content of these workshops if you'd like to watch that, and I'll send you the recording so you can see that in your own time if it's something you think you might be interested in your organization. Next slide, Gabby. So one of the things that we offer at the Well-Led Practice, as well as the services delivered by Gabby and Gabby that can be sort of focused specifically on your own organisation, we also have some software to help you gather some feedback from your staff to show that you're seeking feedback, that you're interested in their well-being, but the feedback that we gather on your behalf using the software also gives you some evidence to show that you're hitting all of what you should be hitting under the well-led key question. So once we've sought that feedback for you, we then present it to you in a report so that you can do some action planning and then show to the CQC that you're hopefully making some improvements and then embedding those improvements. Next slide, Gabby. So here's an example of some of the questions that we'd be asking your staff if you use one of our staff feedback surveys. Questions like, are you proud to work in this organisation? Would you recommend it? Do you have moments of fun at work? Are people credible in the leadership team? So that means do they do what they say they'll do? Do you know the vision and values of the organisation? And we ask these questions because the CQC will be asking your staff anyway when they come to inspect, but also because there's an expectation now that you should be asking your staff these questions too. There's the occasional question that we put in there that we know the CQC don't directly ask, for example, that one I mentioned about having moments of fun at work, but we know that that's really important for measuring how everybody is feeling in the team and what sort of emphasis there is on workforce well-being. So that's why we put those extra questions such as that one in there. We then, on our software, we don't just leave you sort of high and dry. If there's an area that you identify you need to work on, we then have a library of resources, of exercises to do, things to read, either as a group or individual, so that you've got something to put in your action plan, something practical to say that you're going to do. And this allows you to do all of that development work yourself, rather than having to get somebody expensive to come into a golf course with some flip charts and pens and sort of do it for you at a greater cost. So that's the theory behind the software product that we offer, and I'll send some information about that in our follow-up email. We also offer services as well, the workshops that I've talked about for workforce wellbeing, but also some governance workshops too. I offer a conflict workshop, and then we also have our CQC services led by Gabby. We have mock inspections, whether you're looking for a focused one or a full 2-day inspection on absolutely every quality statement under every key question. And we offer some coaching and mentoring as well. So that's us in a nutshell. And what I'll do now is I'll hand over to, I think is it Rashad on the call from the medicines management team, who will take you through